Hey, family, and welcome back to another episode of Stay Juicy. I am your host, Dr. Ariana, and I'm so excited that you are joining me on this journey today. We are going to be delving into the menopause myths. If you don't know, my book called The Menopause Myth, What Your Mother, Doctor, and Friends Never Shared with You About Life After 35, is a book that really delves into the myths. These are myths that as I was going through my own journey, I realized as a OBGYN, as a woman entering into perimenopause, I was misinformed about some things and that there were definitely some myths that were coming into play. I wish I could tell you that I didn't have these experiences with patients that come into my office and literally have gone through multiple providers who have told them either, oh, you couldn't possibly be going through menopause, you're too young, or, just literally dismiss them. Again, this was really part of the impetus of why I wrote the book, because I realized that as a gynecologist, if I wasn't trained and I don't understand menopause, how the hell does the average woman, how are you able to manage this? Like, how are you able to know what you need to know, especially if you go to your provider and you ask questions and you're going with this expectation that you will be educated or somehow helped in this area. So the first myth that we want to be delving into today is this idea that your gynecologist actually knows anything about menopause. Don't get me wrong. It's been 5 years since I've written this book, and I've noticed over the last 5 years, there's been so much more attention to menopause. There's initiatives that are coming out, funding that is going towards women's health and research, and really just beginning to peel back some of the layers of, this veil that we've been under as women, being under-researched, underfunded, and just misunderstood, understood, if that's a word. And so we're just now starting to begin to understand how estrogen's affecting our brain, how menopause affects us in the workplace, and really all of the changes that happen, our cardiovascular health, our bone health, our heart health, it's all related to this journey. But I don't want you to get caught up into this idea that it's just menopause. Menopause at the end of the day is just one day. And that's another myth that we're going to be debunking. Now, let me give you a little backstory, a little history about my background and training. I am double boarded in obstetrics and gynecology and maternal fetal medicine. What that means is that I did a residency in OBGYN. That's what most general gynecologists are going to do. But those that go on to subspecialize would have done a subspecialty. So my subspecialty is in maternal fetal medicine. So I focused in things like the genetics, ultrasound, and just managing high-risk pregnancies, women with hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, all types of things. And so I knew really by the end of my residency that I was going into this field of maternal fetal medicine. Full disclosure, I didn't really pay a whole lot of attention to the gynecology part. I mean, of course, I had to learn it all and I understood it, but at the end of the day, it really wasn't at the front of my radar. But that said, I am very clear about what I learned and what I didn't learn in my residency around menopause. And I'm going to tell you in a nutshell what it was. Just about nothing. And that's really not a surprise, because at the end of the day, most residency programs and medical school programs still are way behind in terms of educating the future providers on this very important part of a woman's life. And it's really not just a part of her life, like it's her whole life. It's up to a third of a woman's life, which is going to be in this menopausal stage. So to give you some reference points, there was a study that was done in the last couple of years. And what they did is they interviewed the residency program directors. Residency program directors are responsible for, really making sure that the curriculum is implemented in residency programs and that those that are going through that program are getting all of the required education that they need in that field. And so a survey went out to these residency directors. The survey was sent to 143 directors. 99 responded, which ended up being about a 69% response rate. Now, I don't want to digress there, but at the end of the day, that's actually a great response rate for a survey. However, it does beg the question of the almost 30% of those residency directors that didn't respond to the survey. It's interesting to wonder what does their GYN program look like in terms of menopause? Because of the people that responded, 31% said that they had a menopause curriculum. And out of all of those programs, they said they had 5 or less lectures that were devoted or dedicated to menopause. And of the people that said they had this menopause curriculum, and I do say that in air quotes because the curriculum could literally have been that the residents went to a clinic where there were women old enough to be in menopause and just happened to have had at least one lecture in menopause. And that would have constituted their menopause curriculum. But that said, of the 71% of the residency directors that responded to the survey, the majority of them said that they had less than 2 lectures even devoted to menopause. And it gets worse. So 69% of the residency directors responded, 31% did not respond. And of the 69% of residency directors that actually responded to the survey, 31% of the residency directors said that they had a menopause curriculum. So I want you to just keep up with these numbers because they get smaller and smaller as it goes along. Of the basically 30% of those that said they had a menopause curriculum, 71% of those, the majority of those said that they had less than 1 to 2 lectures. And all of the residency directors said at the end of the day that if you measured their satisfaction of the quality and the amount of training that residents got in this particular area, out of 10, they rated their satisfaction to 3.75. And in terms of how effective they felt their actual training that existed was, they rated that a 3.83 out of 10. So these again are the residency directors that are reporting what they're actually doing at the residency, and they're reporting their satisfaction rate. If you looked at all of the residency directors that responded to the survey, at the end of the day, all of them had 5 or less lectures around menopause. Again, it's not surprising that most doctors at this point aren't going to get a lot of education and have a big understanding. So the myth is that you're going to go to your doctor, your gynecologist specifically, because you would imagine that your gynecologist should know a thing or two about this. And they're going to be really prepared to talk to you about this. But I really want you to understand that the onus at the end of the day is still going to be on the gynecologist to get that training and make sure they understand this population of women that they're serving. But at the end of the day, they weren't trained. So you very well could walk into your gynecologist's office and really have more of a grasp in terms of understanding some of what the newest information and literature that's out around menopause. And that's kind of scary because, as I mentioned, a woman is going to spend at least 30% of her life in this period. And when I say this period, I mean in her post-reproductive period. And what we found in residencies in general around obstetrics and gynecology is that there's a focus on obstetrics, like how do you deliver babies and all the things that can go right and wrong and all of the algorithms that we need to be aware of in terms of pregnancy. Of course, there's the surgical component where we're making sure that as gynecologists, they're trained in order to do some of the most common surgeries in gynecology, which are going to be hysterectomies and things of that sort. And so, the training is really very much geared towards making sure that the doctors that graduate have enough hands-on training and making sure that they really understand everything about a woman's reproductive cycle, going from their childhood years, teenage years, and then it's definitely into the reproductive years. And there's really not a lot left over for what happens after a woman's no longer reproductive. Now, that's a whole nother conversation. And I think it is definitely a conversation that we need to have at some point of really understanding that at the end of the day, society really puts a lot of emphasis on a woman's reproductive ability. And once a woman is no longer reproductive, it's not a whole lot of interest about what happens to women. I hate to say it, but that's really the truth. That's the reality. And that is slowly changing. The pendulum is slowly moving. But I can tell you, I've had patients walk into my office and literally tell me that their doctor said once they've had a hysterectomy, they don't even need to look in between their legs. Now, I am digressing, but think about it. There's a couple other things between your legs besides the cervix. A lot of women think, oh, I don't have a cervix anymore, so I don't need to get woman exams. I don't need to get checked. I'm like, well, no. You still have a whole vulva down there. You still have a vagina. You still have a urethra. You have a clitoris. You got a lot going on, not to mention what's going on inside the vagina. But at the end of the day, a lot of doctors aren't trained to even understand really what's going on in a woman's vulva area, perineum. They don't know. It's just not a lot of time spent. I hate to tell you. So not only are they not trained in menopause, they're not really given a whole lot of information about what happens after. And so a lot of this is gained in your postgraduate training. You learn this, it's kind of like real life training. You're learning as you go, like, oh, I'm seeing these changes. And of course, you can't learn everything you're going to understand and learn in residency. But my point that I'm trying to get to is that there's a lot more that we could be doing in terms of educating providers around women's health, and especially what happens to women after they are reproductive. And at the end of the day, that's what menopause really is. It's just the period of life where you're no longer reproductive. And as we're living longer, and you understand that a woman could easily be menopausal by 45, if that woman goes on to live to 90, she's now spent 50% of her life in her post-reproductive stage. And I dare say that there are a couple other things that are happening to women in those 50 years that we might want to have a better understanding of. But that just gives you an idea of lack of training, the lack of, I hate to say interest, but at the end of the day, it's just not an area that has a very high focus. And so as a consumer of medical care, you need to go in and really be aware and prepared for how your gynecologist may approach this. I've heard countless stories where women have been just dismissed. You can't be going through menopause, you're too early, especially if they're in their 40s, mid 40s. And we'll again talk about when you really may start to have symptoms, but it's very, very possible that in your mid 40s that you are very much perimenopausal. You can very much be menopausal, and that's completely normal. But even in a lot of gynecologists' minds, this is something that happens much further in life. And if a woman is complaining of these things in her late 30s and early 40s, it just can't be menopause. I've heard this story. I can't even tell you how many times. There's a lot of emotion around menopause. There's a lot of emotion around hormone therapy. There's a lot of opinions. And when you think about it, it's one of those few areas in medicine. There's a lot of areas, I'm not going to lie. I mean, there's a lot of areas where we're not clear on everything. But this area in particular, I hear it so often. A patient will come in and say, well, my gynecologist told me that she didn't believe in hormone treatment, hormone therapy. Well, I mean, in my opinion, that's like saying, I don't believe in treating diabetes. I don't believe in treating thyroid disorders. And not that menopause is a disease. In fact, it is not a disease. It is a natural, biological, normal aging part of life. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of politics that ultimately have gotten woven into women's care. And we're seeing that even now with the effects of Roe v. Wade and the overturning of a lot of reproductive rights that we had previously, but no longer exists. And so I think this even gets woven into a woman's healthcare in general. But again, I digress. I do get almost emotional and very frustrated with our current medical model, and I'll make that very clear. And this is why I left corporate medicine in the first place. Not so much around, how women were getting treated for menopause, but I really appreciated the fact that we were missing the boat in terms of looking at the whole person. And so in my practice, Tula Wellness and Aesthetics here in Tucson, Arizona, I opened the practice 11 years ago. Really, the motivation and the desire for every woman to feel heard and seen and to be treated as a whole. I actually, after I finished my maternal fetal medicine career, which lasted about 20 years, I went on to do an integrative medicine fellowship at the University of Arizona, where Andy Weil actually is a mentor and founded that program. And it really was like a coming home to me, being around like-minded providers that understood that we're looking at a whole person here. We got to look at the emotions. We got to look at the diet. We got to look at all the things. We can't just be throwing pills at people and thinking we're fixing something by just being the Band-Aid solution. So at the end of the day, this is a pervasive issue that really involves healthcare, but it is particularly prevalent in women's health. And my goal, my motivation is to educate as many women and those that are advocates for women's health. And by the way, when I speak women, I understand that there are those that don't identify as women that are still going through menopause. I'm using my terms very generally, so I do appreciate and understand that everyone doesn't identify how their body changes the same way, but I am using the general terms of women and menopause. But that really is the first myth, that your doctor is going to be able to help you with this. And I dare say that there are a lot of doctors that can help you and they are learning. And if you have one of those, great. But what do you do if your doctor doesn't? What do you do if you just go to the doctor and they've dismissed you? You might have even felt a little gaslit. Like, wait a minute, like what? Like you're really acting like this doesn't even exist. Like I'm going crazy. What do you do in that case? Well, you got a couple choices. One choice is to be that person that really sits back and tries to educate the provider and let them know this is what I've researched, and encourage them to do more research and to educate themselves to be a better provider for women. I say show up with papers, show up with information, and show up as an empowered patient. That if you walk into an office, and this has happened to me, a patient walks into an office, she's got studies, she's been researching. I'm like, oh, okay, she's serious. It really does change the dynamic between you and your healthcare provider when you show up prepared. But if you're not up for the struggle, there's another option. You can go to a site called menopause.org, and that is the Menopause Society site. And on that site, you will see a list of providers that have been specifically trained to manage women in menopause. At the end of the day, you don't have to suffer if your provider is not giving you what you need. If they are telling you things that are directly like contradicting what you have read and researched and really believe that you have come to understand, then that just might not be the best provider for you. And you want to find a provider that at the end of the day is going to hear you, who's going to see you. But again, remember, your doctor may not have been trained and they really may not be prepared to have this conversation. It's not personal and it's unfortunate, but you have a choice at that point on how you want to go forward. I hope that this episode gave you some understanding and hopefully just some support to know that you're not alone, and that if you've gone to your provider and you felt like you've been gaslit or otherwise not been taken seriously, that you do have options, right? I highly encourage you to do your own research and to advocate for yourself and to empower yourself with information. As women, you have to have that knowledge, whether you're a person of color, any group that is not as represented, or that there's just been evidence that sometimes we don't get all of the right answers and all of the best care. Be an advocate for yourself. In closing, ladies, remember, stay brilliant, stay beautiful, but most of all, please stay juicy. I'm Dr. Ariana, and I will see you on the next one.